November 3rd, 1942. 12 miles northeast of Kokumbona Point, Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Commander Yoshi Tanaka's supply runner cuts through morning fog toward Japanese positions along the Lunga River, carrying dried fish and 500 kilograms of rice, 4 days of half rations for 800 men. Then his lookout spots something impossible: an American landing craft, beached and abandoned on the coral reef, cargo bay doors hanging open like an invitation. Tanaka's crew scrambles aboard, weapons drawn, expecting ambush, finding only silence and breakfast. Wooden crates stacked floor to ceiling, each stenciled with markings in English. His men pry open the first crate. Inside, cylindrical tins, olive drab, each labelled Ration, Combat, Individual. 36 tins arranged in neat rows. His executive officer opens a second crate. Identical contents, a third crate, the same. They count 17 crates before stopping because the mathematics become meaningless when multiplied against what they're carrying. 500 kilograms of rice to feed 800 men for 4 days. This abandoned American boat contains enough food for how many men for how long? Tanaka pulls out his notepad to calculate, but first he opens one of the tins. The smell hits him before he sees the contents. Meat. Real meat. Not dried fish or canned tuna. Pork and beans in tomato sauce, still sealed, manufacturing date stamped on the bottom, August 1942, 10 weeks ago. This food is fresher than anything his garrison has seen in 4 months. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He opens another tin. Beef hash with potatoes. Another. Chicken and vegetables. His executive officer hands him a smaller package from inside one of the tins. Crackers, chocolate bar, cigarettes, 4 Lucky Strikes in a small pack, chewing gum, instant coffee, sugar tablets. This is one meal. One American soldier's single meal contains more variety than his entire crew has eaten in a week. Tanaka does the calculation he's been avoiding. 36 tins per crate, 17 crates visible in just this forward section, 612 individual meals, minimum. Each tin weighs approximately 1 pound, more than 250 kilograms of food in 17 crates. The entire cargo bay has at least 60 crates, over 2,100 meals, over 900 kilograms of prepared food. The Americans abandoned this boat. They evacuated under fire, or maybe just during a tactical withdrawal. They left behind enough supplies to feed a Japanese infantry company for 2 weeks without even attempting to recover it. Not because they couldn't, because replacement was faster than recovery. The numbers are impossible, unless the assessment his naval intelligence had warned about 3 months ago was not exaggeration but understatement. Unless America's industrial production represented not a temporary advantage but a permanent asymmetry Japan could never overcome. The morning Tanaka discovered that abandoned landing craft, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal numbered approximately 22,000 men, receiving what headquarters in Rabaul optimistically classified as 3-quarter rations. In reality, 600 grams of rice per day when supply convoys succeeded, half that when submarines or surface ships were sunk trying to reach the island. No fresh vegetables, no refrigerated meat, canned fish when available, dried plums, salt, occasionally miso paste. Men supplemented rations by foraging jungle plants they couldn't identify, fishing when artillery fire paused long enough, boiling tree bark when nothing else could be found. Medical officers reported 17 cases of beriberi in the past month. Dysentery was endemic. Malnutrition had reduced infantry platoons from 40 men to 25, not through combat casualties, but through men too weak to patrol. When headquarters requested casualty figures, commanders filed reports distinguishing between killed in action and died from disease and starvation, a distinction that recognized what everyone knew but few dared say aloud. Japan's logistics could not sustain operations this far from home waters. Tanaka had joined the Imperial Navy in 1935. He'd studied at Etajima, graduated near the top of his class, served aboard destroyers in Chinese waters during the Second Sino-Japanese War. He understood logistics. He'd read the pre-war assessments about Japan's limited merchant fleet capacity, its dependence on resource importation, its vulnerability to blockade. But those assessments had been theoretical, distance measured on charts, tonnage calculated in ledgers. This was different. This was 600 grams of rice stretched into 2 meals, while American soldiers ate pork and beans from cans manufactured 10 weeks ago, shipped 9,000 miles to be abandoned on a beach. He ordered his crew to transfer everything they could carry. The crates were too heavy to move intact, so they broke them open and loaded individual tins into their own supply bags. They worked for 40 minutes, constantly scanning the tree line for American patrols, loading 180 tins before their small boat reached capacity. 180 meals, approximately 80 kilograms. They left over 1,800 meals in the abandoned landing craft because they physically could not carry more. Before leaving, Tanaka walked through the entire cargo bay, counting crates, reading labels, documenting what Japanese command needed to see but probably wouldn't believe. 63 crates of sea rations, 2,268 individual meals, medical supplies, morphine, sulfur drugs, bandages, iodine, enough to stock a field hospital for 2 months. Ammunition, 30 caliber rounds in sealed, metal cans, 500 rounds per can, 20 cans visible. Cigarettes, not individual packs but cartons, 200 cartons stacked near the rear bulkhead, 4,000 packs, 80,000 cigarettes. For soldiers, not officers. Soldiers received cigarettes as standard issue. His executive officer found something else, tucked between supply crates. American periodicals dated October 1942. Life, Saturday Evening Post, Reader's Digest. He flipped through one. Advertisements showed families eating meat at dinner tables. Department store displays featured clothing variety that Japanese civilians hadn't seen since rationing began in 1940. Car advertisements, appliance advertisements. The imagery was carefully curated propaganda, obviously, but even propaganda revealed something about industrial capacity when it could afford to print magazines on glossy paper and ship them 9,000 miles to be distributed to soldiers fighting in jungles. Tanaka returned to his supply runner and started the engine. His crew secured the captured rations, stacking tins carefully in the cargo hold, treating them like artillery shells because in terms of tactical value, food was more precious than ammunition. They could manufacture bullets. They could build destroyers. They couldn't manufacture calories out of seawater. And the Americans could apparently afford to abandon more food on a single landing craft than Japanese supply convoys delivered to Guadalcanal in a week. He filed his report to headquarters at Rabaul on November 5th, 2 days after discovering the landing craft. The document ran to 7 pages, single-spaced, with detailed inventory lists and caloric calculations. He included estimates of American ration superiority. One sea ration provided approximately 3,000 calories, enough to sustain a soldier for a full day of combat operations. Japanese field rations provided 2,100 calories at best, often less, requiring constant foraging supplementation that reduced combat effectiveness and increased disease rates. The report documented not just what he had found, but what it implied. If Americans were abandoning supplies on isolated beaches, their logistics chain was not merely adequate, it was abundant to the point of casual waste. If individual soldiers received cigarettes and chocolate as standard issue, American industrial production had achieved surplus capacity in non-essential luxuries while Japanese soldiers lacked essential nutrition. If field rations contained multiple varieties of prepared meat, American food processing infrastructure operated at scales Japanese planners had never attempted. He waited for acknowledgement, for questions seeking clarification, for orders requesting additional reconnaissance to verify the findings. Nothing came. The report disappeared into administrative channels, the way uncomfortable truths always disappeared when confronting them required. Admitting that strategic assumptions might have been wrong from the beginning, But Tanaka kept his own documentation. He photographed the tins. He saved sample rations, storing them in sealed containers with desiccant to preserve them as evidence. He compiled additional reports as other encounters revealed similar patterns. In December, a Japanese patrol overran an American supply dump near the Matanikau River and captured 12 crates of K-rations lighter, more portable meals designed for paratroopers and mobile infantry. Each K-ration provided 2,800 calories across 3 meal units. Each carton contained not just food but amenities: toilet paper, matches, cigarettes, chewing gum, a wooden spoon. The Americans included wooden spoons in field rations because replacing disposable utensils was easier than training soldiers to carry reusable mess kits. The patrol brought back 14 K-rations intact for headquarters analysis. Junior officers opened them carefully, documenting every component, weighing each item, calculating caloric density. The breakfast unit contained canned chopped ham and eggs, biscuits, a fruit bar, instant coffee, sugar cubes, cigarettes, chewing gum. The dinner unit: canned cheese, biscuits, candy, lemon powder, cigarettes, gum. The supper unit: canned meatloaf, biscuits, bouillon powder, chocolate bar, cigarettes, gum. 3 complete meals, weighing less than 1 kilogram total, packaged to survive tropical humidity, designed to be eaten cold if necessary, but providing enough fuel for sustained combat operations. The report from that patrol included a note that Tanaka found more revealing than any supply manifest. Men who captured these rations consumed them immediately, rather than turning them over to supply officers. When confronted, they stated American food was more nourishing than our standard issue, and they needed strength for continued operations. This was not a logistics failure. This was morale collapse, triggered by nutritional reality. Japanese soldiers preferred enemy rations because enemy rations kept you alive. Intelligence summaries from other sectors began arriving with disturbing frequency. At Buna, Papua New Guinea, Japanese forces captured Australian supply dumps containing American sea rations, canned beef, powdered milk, real coffee, not the chicory substitute Japanese troops received. At Munda Point in the Central Solomons, a destroyed American supply depot yielded thousands of cans of fruit cocktail, peaches in syrup, pineapple chunks. Fruit, as standard combat rations. The logistics officer who filed that report noted, "Our men have not received fresh fruit in 6 months. Enemy soldiers receive canned fruit in varieties we cannot identify." February 1943 brought confirmation of what Tanaka had calculated months earlier. Japanese command ordered evacuation from Guadalcanal. The official reason: strategic redeployment to consolidate defensive positions in the Central Solomons. The actual reason appeared in casualty reports that medical officers finally began filing honestly. Of approximately 31,000 Japanese soldiers committed to Guadalcanal operations, approximately 23,000 were dead, missing, or evacuated as non-combat effective. Combat casualties: approximately 7,000 killed in action. Disease and starvation casualties: approximately 16,000. 70% of Japanese deaths on Guadalcanal resulted not from American bullets, but from Japan's inability to deliver food to soldiers fighting 9,000 miles from Tokyo. The evacuation convoys brought back skeletal survivors who weighed 40 kilograms, less than they'd weighed at age 14. Medical ships reported men whose digestive systems had stopped functioning, who couldn't process solid food even when it became available. Dental records showed widespread tooth loss from vitamin deficiency. Psychological evaluations documented what doctors termed starvation psychosis: men who hoarded food compulsively, who fought over scraps, who'd lost the ability to think beyond the next meal. Tanaka stood on the dock at Rabaul and watched them disembark. These were not defeated soldiers. These were starved men who'd lost a logistics war. Their weapons still functioned. Their training remained intact, but their bodies had consumed themselves because the Imperial Navy could not deliver 600 grams of rice per day consistently across 400 nautical miles of submarine-infested waters. He thought about the abandoned landing craft with its 2,100 meals. The Americans could afford to leave more food on one beach than Japan delivered to Guadalcanal in a week. That single data point contained the entire story of the Pacific War, compressed into one undeniable arithmetic fact. By April 1943, Tanaka had been reassigned to logistics planning at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Truk. His role: analyze supply requirements for defensive operations across the Central Pacific. The assignment felt like punishment disguised as promotion, removing him from field operations where he'd seen too much, placing him in bureaucratic positions where uncomfortable assessments could be quietly buried. But the documents crossed his desk anyway. Production reports from the home islands, merchant shipping availability analyses, casualty summaries from garrisons on bypassed islands, reconnaissance photography from American rear areas, and the terrible mathematics of industrial asymmetry that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. The American ration situation he'd discovered at Guadalcanal was not isolated abundance. It was systematic overproduction built into an industrial machine Japan never understood because Japan never possessed it. The United States had built food processing infrastructure during peacetime, driven by commercial competition among private companies seeking consumer market share. Heinz, Campbell's, Libby's, Del Monte corporations that had spent decades perfecting mass production of canned goods for civilian consumption and then simply scaled up production for military contracts. Japanese food processing remained artisanal by comparison, small facilities producing limited quantities under government supervision. No competitive market driving efficiency improvements, no peacetime infrastructure that could simply expand when war came. Japan's largest food canning companies could produce perhaps 5 million cans per year. American companies produced 5 million cans per month. The disparity wasn't temporary, it was structural. It had been built during 20 years of peacetime industrial development that Japan had spent those same years fighting wars in Manchuria and China. The intelligence reports arriving at Tanaka's desk in Truk painted a picture so comprehensive and so devastating that ignoring it required willful institutional blindness. But the Imperial Japanese Navy had become expert at selective vision, seeing tactical victories while overlooking strategic catastrophe, celebrating individual courage while dismissing material reality. A May 1943 assessment from Naval Intelligence in Tokyo documented American food production capacity based on captured documents and reconnaissance of West Coast ports. The numbers were staggering even by American standards of excess. Annual meat production, 11 billion pounds. Annual wheat production, 900 million bushels. Canning industry capacity, 8 billion cans per year, and expanding. The assessment noted these figures represented not maximum wartime production, but normal peacetime baseline production that America had simply redirected toward military use while maintaining civilian food availability at near pre-war levels. Tanaka cross-referenced these figures against Japanese production. Annual meat production in Japan and occupied territories, 1.2 billion pounds, most of which never reached military garrisons due to shipping losses. Annual rice production, 13 million metric tons, of which approximately 4 million tons could theoretically be allocated to military use if civilians accepted starvation rations. Canning capacity, negligible by comparison, with most preserved food using traditional methods drying, salting, pickling, that produced less durable and less nutritionally complete results. The ratio was approximately 8-1. For every ton of food Japan could produce and transport to forward garrisons, America could produce and transport 8 tons. But even that stark ratio understated the reality because it measured production capacity without accounting for distribution capability. Japan's merchant fleet was shrinking monthly as American submarines hunted tankers and transports. America's merchant fleet was growing weekly as Liberty ships launched from shipyards at rates Japanese intelligence initially dismissed as propaganda until reconnaissance confirmed the impossible was merely American. He remembered the landing craft at Guadalcanal, 2,100 meals abandoned without ceremony because recovering them was less efficient than ordering replacements. That casual waste was strategic power measured in a different currency than battleships and aircraft. You could sink American supply ships faster than they built them, though even that was proving impossible, and it wouldn't matter, because American production capacity exceeded American needs by margins that made losses tactically inconvenient but strategically irrelevant. A June report from Rabaul detailed conditions on bypassed garrisons in the northern Solomons. Japanese forces on Bougainville, isolated from resupply by American air superiority, had transitioned from military operations to subsistence farming. Approximately 12,000 troops, cultivating gardens, fishing, foraging, attempting to produce enough food locally to prevent starvation. Combat capability. Effectively zero. Not because they lacked weapons or training, but because malnourished men cannot fight. The commander's report was clinical in its assessment. Men require 2,400 calories per day minimum to maintain combat effectiveness. Current food production yields approximately 1,600 calories per day per man. This deficit results in progressive strength loss, reduced cognitive function, increased disease susceptibility, and eventual death if sustained beyond 8 weeks. We are entering week 23. Similar reports arrived from New Guinea, where Japanese garrisons along the northern coast faced identical logistics strangulation. American forces had not assaulted these positions directly. They had simply bypassed them, established air superiority, interdicted supply routes, and allowed starvation to accomplish what invasion would have cost thousands of American casualties. It was warfare as siege conducted across an entire theatre, made possible by logistics abundance that could afford to feed attacking forces while starving defensive positions. Tanaka compiled a comprehensive assessment in July 1943, documenting the strategic implications of food logistics across all Pacific operations. The report began with a simple premise. Modern warfare is decided by the side that can sustain operations longest, and sustainability is measured in calories delivered per soldier per day over distance over time. He presented comparative analyses. American soldiers in the South Pacific received approximately 4,500 calories per day through a combination of field rations, supplementary fresh food when available, and access to recreational amenities like ice cream aboard support vessels. Japanese soldiers in forward positions received 1,200 to 1,800 calories per day when supply lines functioned, less than 800 calories when supply lines failed. The differential meant American forces could sustain high-intensity combat operations indefinitely, while Japanese forces exhausted themselves in weeks. The report included casualty projections based on established medical data about malnutrition effects. A soldier receiving insufficient calories for 8 weeks loses approximately 30% of body weight and 50% of combat effectiveness. At 12 weeks, cognitive impairment becomes severe, reduced decision-making ability, impaired judgment, difficulty processing complex information. At 16 weeks, organ failure begins. At 20 weeks, death becomes likely even if full nutrition is eventually restored because damage becomes irreversible. These were not hypothetical timelines. These were actual conditions at dozens of Japanese garrisons across the Pacific. At Kolombangara, approximately 9,000 troops were entering week 18 of progressive starvation. At Vila, 5,000 men were at week 14. On New Britain, isolated units were at week 22. The mathematics predicted mass casualties not from combat, but from organ failure in the coming months, and the mathematics proved accurate as medical reports confirmed men dying from beriberi-induced heart failure, from dysentery-weakened bodies unable to fight infection, from simple nutritional depletion that exhausted reserves the body couldn't rebuild. He submitted the report through official channels on July 15, 1943. It reached Combined Fleet Headquarters on July 19. He received acknowledgement of receipt on July 21. He never received response to the content. The assessment disappeared into filing systems designed to preserve institutional consensus rather than confront institutional failure. But the evidence kept accumulating anyway. In August, Japanese forces evacuated Vella La Vella in the Central Solomons. Of 3,800 troops originally garrisoned there, approximately 900 were evacuated. Combat casualties, 200. Disease and starvation, approximately 2,700. The remaining soldiers were either too weak to reach evacuation points or had died in jungle positions where their bodies would never be recovered. The evacuation convoys brought testimony that medical officers found difficult to document in official language. Soldiers reported instances of cannibalism among isolated units, not as organized decision, but as individual psychological breakdown when starvation reached terminal stages. The reports were classified at levels above Tanaka's clearance, but the information circulated anyway through informal channels because everyone needed to know what the war had become when logistics failed completely. September brought new intelligence about American supply operations in the Pacific. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed Espiritu Santo, a major American forward base in the New Hebrides. The photographs showed supply depots covering 4 square kilometers, fuel storage for 6 million gallons, food warehouses sufficient to sustain 50,000 troops for 6 months. The base had been established 8 months earlier. In 8 months, Americans had built logistics infrastructure larger than Japan's total forward capacity across the entire South Pacific. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The photographs revealed something else that Tanaka found more unsettling than sheer quantity. The supply depots were organized with geometric precision, warehouses arranged in grid patterns with wide roads for truck access. Fuel storage segregated by type with safety distances calculated to prevent sympathetic detonation. Food storage separated by category: refrigerated, dry goods, canned goods with rotation schedules, ensuring first-in, first-out distribution, preventing spoilage. This was not improvised field logistics. This was industrial supply chain management applied to military operations, with the same systematic efficiency American factories applied to automobile production. Japanese supply operations, by comparison, remained essentially improvisational. Supplies arrived when convoys succeeded in reaching their destinations. Distribution occurred through ad hoc methods, depending on local commanders' initiative. Storage was whatever protection could be constructed from available materials. Spoilage rates were high. Waste was common. The entire system assumed scarcity and operated accordingly, which created self-fulfilling prophecies where inefficiency compounded scarcity into crisis. October 1943 brought the assessment Tanaka had been dreading. Combined Fleet Intelligence compiled comprehensive casualty analyses across all Pacific operations, from December 1941 through September 1943. Total Japanese military deaths, approximately 480,000. Combat casualties, approximately 150,000. Disease and starvation, approximately 330,000. 69% of Japanese military deaths in the Pacific War had resulted from non-combat causes, primarily malnutrition and disease that well-fed soldiers could have resisted. The report included comparative analysis of American casualties. Total American military deaths in Pacific operations, approximately 28,000. Combat casualties, approximately 23,000. Disease and starvation, approximately 5,000, most occurring during the early Guadalcanal campaign before supply lines were fully established. 82% of American deaths were combat casualties. American logistics kept soldiers alive and fighting effective. Japanese logistics killed more soldiers than the enemy did. Tanaka reviewed these figures repeatedly, checking calculations, verifying sources, hoping to find errors that would make the truth less terrible. The numbers were accurate. The implications were undeniable. Japan was losing the Pacific War, not primarily through tactical defeats, but through strategic starvation. Every bypassed garrison was a massacre in slow motion. Every isolated island was a death sentence carried out over months. American strategy had evolved into something devastatingly efficient. Isolate Japanese positions, establish air superiority, prevent resupply, and let hunger accomplish what assault would cost. He thought about the American landing craft again, 2,100 meals abandoned on a beach. That casual abundance represented power that Japan's warrior ethos couldn't overcome, because warrior ethos didn't matter when soldiers were too weak to stand. Fighting spirit meant nothing when the body consumed itself for energy. All the courage in the world couldn't compensate for a logistics system that killed its own soldiers through the inability to feed them. November brought news from Tokyo that the home islands were implementing stricter food rationing. Civilian rice rations reduced to 297 grams per day, meat eliminated except for essential workers. Fish rationed to 1.8 ounces per day. The population was being starved to feed an army that was itself starving. The system was cannibalizing itself at every level, consuming seed corn to plant fields that would yield smaller harvests each year, because fertilizer production required oil that tankers couldn't deliver, because submarines sank them faster than shipyards could replace them. The mathematics spiraled downward with inexorable logic. Reduced civilian nutrition meant reduced worker productivity. Reduced productivity meant decreased industrial output. Decreased output meant fewer weapons and ships and supplies for military operations. Military defeats meant loss of resource territories. Loss of territories meant even less food and fuel reaching the home islands. The cycle fed itself, each deficiency compounding into larger deficiencies, and nowhere in the entire system was there surplus capacity to break the spiral, because Japan had never built surplus capacity, and now had no time to build it. December 1943 brought the final confirmation Tanaka needed. Intelligence reports from the Gilbert Islands documented American amphibious assaults on Tarawa and Makin. The operations succeeded despite fierce Japanese resistance. But what struck Tanaka was the logistical detail in after-action reports. American forces had established field bakeries on Tarawa within 48 hours of securing the island. Bakeries, producing fresh bread. 2 days after the battle ended, the Americans considered fresh bread a standard provision important enough to prioritize above other reconstruction efforts. Japanese forces on Tarawa had defended the island while subsisting on rice and dried fish. American forces captured the island and immediately established infrastructure to provide soldiers with fresh bread. The disparity wasn't just quantitative, it was philosophical. America had built a military logistics system that assumed soldiers deserved not just adequate nutrition, but optimal nutrition, with amenities that sustained morale. Japan had built a system that assumed soldiers would endure hardship silently and fight effectively, regardless of deprivation. One assumption proved correct. One assumption proved catastrophic. Tanaka knew which was which, but the institution he served had made its bet decades earlier, and could not change course now without admitting the bet had been wrong from the start. By January 1944, Tanaka had compiled documentation that naval intelligence could no longer ignore without deliberate suppression. He prepared a final comprehensive assessment, 300 pages, documenting every aspect of the food logistics crisis. Production capacities, distribution, failures, casualty analyses, garrison starvation rates, comparative assessments of American abundance, projections showing that current trends made Japanese military operations unsustainable within 18 months, regardless of tactical performance. The report included recommendations that Tanaka knew were politically impossible, but professionally necessary. First, immediately negotiate conditional surrender before casualties from starvation exceeded all combat losses combined. Second, if surrender was unacceptable, then redirect all remaining merchant shipping to food transport rather than troop reinforcement, accepting loss of offensive capability to prevent complete garrison collapse. Third, if neither option was viable, then establish explicit triage protocols, abandoning garrisons that could not be supplied, rather than sending soldiers to certain starvation while maintaining the fiction of strategic defense. He submitted the report on January 28, 1944. It reached Combined Fleet Headquarters on February 2nd. On February 7th, he received new orders. He was being transferred to administrative duties in Yokosuka, effective immediately. The orders made no mention of his report. The message was clear. Officers who saw too clearly got moved somewhere their vision didn't matter. Yokosuka Naval Base, March 1944. Tanaka's new office overlooked the harbor, where destroyers that would never have enough fuel to operate effectively were being fitted with equipment they would never have enough ammunition to use. His title was Assistant Director of Logistics Coordination, which sounded important and meant nothing. His actual function was processing paperwork, routing requisition forms, maintaining filing systems that documented the Empire's slow starvation in triplicate. But even in bureaucratic exile, the truth continued arriving on his desk, not by design. Simply because logistics documentation had to flow somewhere, and Tanaka's office was where forms accumulated before being filed into archives nobody would read, until historians decades later tried to understand how an entire military institution chose blindness over adaptation. A March report from the Marshall Islands documented the American capture of Kwajalein and Eniwetok. Japanese garrisons had fought to near annihilation 8,000 defenders on Kwajalein, 5,000 on Eniwetok, fewer than 300 captured alive from both islands combined. The reports praised their fighting spirit, their refusal to surrender, their acceptance of death with honor. But the medical data told a different story. Autopsies of recovered bodies showed 67% had body weight below minimum survivable thresholds before combat began. The defenders had fought to the death while already dying from starvation. American casualties on Kwajalein, approximately 370 killed. American logistics during the operation, field hospitals with surgical facilities, refrigerated blood supplies, complete pharmaceutical inventories. American casualties on Eniwetok, approximately 300 killed. American logistics, portable desalination units providing unlimited fresh water, field kitchens serving hot meals, ice cream ships providing recreational morale support. Ice cream ships. The Americans had vessels whose primary function was producing ice cream for soldiers, not as luxury for officers. As standard morale provision for enlisted personnel, they had such surplus refrigeration capacity that they could afford to dedicate ships to frozen dessert production. Meanwhile, Japanese soldiers were dying from dysentery caused by drinking brackish water because medical supplies couldn't reach them. The comparison was so absurd, it transcended comedy into tragedy. One side fought with ice cream ships, the other side fought while starving to death. And the side with ice cream ships was winning not because their soldiers were braver or their tactics better, but because their industrial system could sustain operations indefinitely, while their enemy's industrial system was consuming itself. April brought documentation from New Guinea that Tanaka initially assumed was error or propaganda. Casualty reports from the 18th Army showed approximately 158,000 Japanese deaths from January through March 1944. Combat casualties, approximately 11,000. Disease and starvation, approximately 147,000, 93% non-combat deaths. The 18th Army was ceasing to exist, not through American offensives, but through logistical extinction. He verified the numbers through multiple sources. They were accurate. In some sectors, entire battalions had disappeared without combat engagement. Patrols sent to contact them found villages of corpses, men who died at their positions from starvation and disease. Equipment intact, weapons functional, bodies consumed by tropical rot before anyone could evacuate them for proper burial. The jungle was becoming a vast cemetery where Japan's soldiers vanished into unmarked graves because the Empire couldn't deliver 600 grams of rice per day across 400 miles of contested water. May 1944 brought news that American forces had bypassed Truk, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, Japan's supposedly impregnable Central Pacific bastion. Rather than assault the heavily fortified base, Americans had simply established air superiority, interdicted supply lines, and moved on to the Marianas. 27,000 Japanese troops remained on Truk with enough ammunition to fight for months, but enough food to survive for perhaps 6 weeks. Another garrison sentenced to slow starvation while maintaining the fiction that they were defending strategic positions. The commander at Truk sent repeated requests for supply convoys. Combined Fleet responded with orders to establish self-sufficiency through local food production, fishing, farming, foraging. The orders treated starvation as a logistics problem soldiers could solve through initiative, rather than as a strategic failure that command needed to address through operational changes. Plant gardens. Catch fish. Don't mention that garrison soldiers have no agricultural training, that tropical soil yields poor crops without fertilizer they don't have, that fishing requires time and equipment combat operations don't permit. June brought the American invasion of the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam Islands within bomber range of Tokyo. Japanese command committed everything available to their defense. 31,000 troops on Saipan, 9,000 on Tinian, 22,000 on Guam. The battles lasted weeks and ended with near-total Japanese casualties. But again, the medical data revealed what official reports obscured. Approximately 40% of defenders on Saipan showed signs of advanced malnutrition before combat began. On Tinian, medical supplies ran out within 72 hours of invasion. On Guam, defenders were subsisting on 800 calories per day when American forces landed. American forces on Saipan operated with complete logistics support, field hospitals with full surgical capabilities, blood supplies sufficient for thousands of transfusions, food supplies providing 4,500 calories per soldier per day. The contrast appeared in casualty survival rates. American wounded had 73% survival rates. Japanese wounded had 12% survival rates, not because American weapons were more effective, but because American medical logistics could save soldiers who would die in Japanese care from treatable wounds. The battle for Saipan ended with approximately 30,000 Japanese dead and fewer than 1,000 captured. American casualties: approximately 3,000 dead, 13,000 wounded. But those 13,000 wounded mostly survived and eventually returned to duty because American logistics could sustain life. Japanese wounded mostly died because Japanese logistics couldn't deliver morphine or sulfur drugs or plasma in quantities necessary to prevent shock and infection. Tanaka received orders in July to prepare logistics assessments for homeland defense operations. The premise was that American invasion of the home islands would occur sometime in 1945, and Japan needed to prepare supply distribution networks for defensive battles on Japanese soil. The assignment was both realistic. Invasion was increasingly probable and absurd, because if Japan couldn't supply garrisons 400 miles from Tokyo, how would it supply forces defending Tokyo itself when American submarines controlled all approaches and American aircraft controlled all airspace? He prepared the assessment anyway. Professional obligation demanded it. The numbers were predictable. Current food stocks in the home islands: sufficient for civilian population at minimal rations for approximately 8 months, assuming no imports. Military food stocks: sufficient for current deployed forces for approximately 4 months at current reduced ration rates. Projected food availability for homeland defense: insufficient for sustained operations exceeding 6 weeks unless drastic civilian rationing implemented, which would cause domestic unrest, reduce industrial productivity, and undermine war effort through population malnutrition. The assessment concluded that homeland defense was logistically unsustainable at current resource availability levels. Japan could fight invasion battles but could not sustain defensive campaigns. Every week of combat would consume food stocks that couldn't be replaced because merchant shipping no longer existed in quantities sufficient to import food from occupied territories that American forces were systematically liberating. Anyway, he submitted the assessment in August 1944. It disappeared into filing systems like every other uncomfortable truth. But this time, Tanaka included a personal memorandum addressed to Admiral Minachi Koga, Combined Fleet Commander. The memorandum abandoned formal language in favor of direct statement. Japan was losing the war through starvation. Combat operations were secondary to logistics failure. No amount of tactical brilliance or fighting spirit could compensate for the inability to feed soldiers. Continuing current operations meant killing hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops through malnutrition while accomplishing no strategic objective except demonstrating that Japan could die with honor. The memorandum asked a simple question: was honor more important than survival? Because current operations guaranteed honor and ensured death. Alternative strategies might compromise honor but could preserve lives. The emperor's subjects were dying from hunger, while defending positions that served no purpose except maintaining institutional pride. When did duty to the emperor become duty to starve in silence? Admiral Koga never responded. Perhaps the memorandum never reached him. Perhaps it reached him, and he chose not to acknowledge it. Perhaps acknowledging it would have required confronting questions that had no acceptable answers within the framework of military honor that defined Japanese naval culture. Tanaka would never know, because 3 weeks later, Admiral Koga died in a plane crash while transferring from Truk to Davao, and his replacement, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, had no interest in revisiting logistics assessments from junior officers who'd been transferred to administrative positions specifically to silence them. September 1944 brought reports from the Philippines documenting preliminary American preparations for invasion. Reconnaissance showed massive supply buildups at bases in New Guinea and the Admiralty Islands, hundreds of cargo ships assembling in, staging areas, fuel depots containing millions of gallons of aviation, gasoline and diesel, food warehouses sufficient to sustain 200,000 troops for 6 months, medical supplies including mobile surgical hospitals, blood banks, pharmaceutical stockpiles that exceeded Japan's total national medical inventory. The comparison was no longer even numerically comprehensible. American preparations for one invasion operation involved more food than Japan transported to all Pacific garrisons in a year. One operation, one theater. American logistics could simultaneously support major campaigns in Europe and the Pacific, while maintaining surplus capacity for ice cream ships and fresh bread bakeries, because American industrial production had achieved scales where military needs represented fraction of total capacity rather than absolute ceiling. October brought the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Combined Fleet committed nearly every operational warship in a desperate attempt to disrupt American invasion of the Philippines. The battle became the largest naval engagement in history. Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers. American losses were comparatively minor, but the battle's outcome was decided before the first shot fired because Japanese ships operated with insufficient fuel, aircraft launched with minimal ammunition, and crews had been on reduced rations for weeks. Tanaka reviewed battle damage reports and found details that never appeared in official summaries. Several Japanese destroyers had run out of fuel during the battle and been scuttled by their own crews. Aircraft from Japanese carriers had jettisoned ordnance to extend range because they lacked fuel for combat and return flight. Surviving crew members from sunken vessels described sailors too malnourished to survive extended time in the water, men who drowned not from wounds but from bodies too depleted to keep swimming until rescue arrived. The battle reports praised Japanese courage, sacrifice, willingness to die for the emperor. But courage couldn't fire guns without ammunition. Sacrifice couldn't move ships without fuel. Willingness to die didn't change the mathematics that Japanese logistics couldn't sustain combat operations, while American logistics could sustain multiple simultaneous campaigns indefinitely. By November 1944, the truth Tanaka had been documenting for 2 years had become so obvious that even official reports could no longer completely obscure it. Casualty summaries from across the Pacific showed total Japanese military deaths exceeding 1 million. Combat casualties, approximately 300,000. Disease and starvation, approximately 700,000. 70% of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen killed in the Pacific War had died from non-combat causes, primarily malnutrition and disease that adequate food and medical supplies could have prevented. Those 700,000 deaths represented strategic failure measured in individual tragedies. 700,000 men who'd trained for years, deployed across thousands of miles, occupied defensive positions, and then slowly starved to death while holding ground that served no purpose except maintaining the fiction that Japan was fighting rather than dying. 700,000 families receiving notifications that their sons or husbands or fathers had died honorably, serving the emperor without being told that died honorably often meant starved slowly on a bypassed island. Tanaka began writing a comprehensive final assessment in December 1944, not an official report. Those had proven useless. Instead, a personal document recording what he'd witnessed and calculated over 3 years of logistics analysis. Documentation for historians who would eventually try to understand how institutional culture prevented strategic adaptation, even when everyone involved understood the situation. The document began with the abandoned landing craft at Guadalcanal and traced forward through every logistics failure, every starvation report, every garrison that ceased to exist not through combat but through hunger. It included all the calculations showing American industrial superiority, all the casualty analyses showing that Japan was killing its own soldiers through logistical inadequacy, all the recommendations that had been ignored because they required admitting the war was unwinnable through current strategies. The document concluded with assessment Tanaka had avoided, stating explicitly in official reports, Japan had lost the Pacific War in 1941 when it chose to fight an opponent whose peacetime industrial infrastructure could produce more war materials as routine output than Japan could produce at maximum wartime. Mobilization. Every battle since then had been postponing the inevitable while paying for delay with hundreds of thousands of lives that served no saces to strategic purpose except demonstrating Japan's capacity for self-destruction. The American landing craft at Guadalcanal had contained the entire truth compressed into one undeniable fact: 2,100 meals abandoned because recovering them was less efficient than manufacturing replacements. That casual abundance was the war. Everything else, the battles, the courage, the sacrifice, was theatre performed while the fundamental question had already been answered. Japan couldn't feed its army. America could. That asymmetry decided everything. January 1945 brought news of American landings on Luzon in the Philippines. 43,000 Japanese defenders faced 200,000 American attackers, supported by complete logistics networks that could sustain operations indefinitely. The battle lasted months and ended with approximately 41,000 Japanese dead. Starvation and disease caused 78% of those deaths. Combat caused 22%. Another garrison that fought to annihilation while starving because Japanese logistics had collapsed completely. February brought American invasion of Iwo Jima. 21,000 Japanese defenders on an island 8 square miles in size. Complete isolation from resupply. Food stocks sufficient for 2 months at half rations. Medical supplies for perhaps 3 weeks. The defenders fought for 36 days before organized resistance ceased. 20,800 Japanese dead, 216 captured. Nearly total annihilation defending an island that mattered only because the Japanese command needed to demonstrate it could fight rather than admit it had lost. March brought the firebombing of Tokyo. American B-29 bombers, operating from the Marianas, systematically destroyed Japanese cities that could no longer be defended because fighter aircraft lacked fuel for interception and anti-aircraft batteries lacked ammunition for sustained fire. The firebombing killed approximately 100,000 civilians in a single night and demonstrated that American logistics could support strategic bombing campaigns against the home islands while simultaneously conducting ground operations across the Pacific. April brought the American invasion of Okinawa. 77,000 Japanese defenders, including 30,000 Okinawan conscripts, food supplies for perhaps 60 days, medical capacity for maybe 2 weeks of sustained combat. The battle lasted 82 days. Japanese casualties. Approximately 77,000 military deaths plus 40,000 to 150,000 civilian deaths. American casualties. Approximately 12,000 military deaths, 38,000 wounded, most of whom survived, because American medical logistics could save soldiers who would have died in Japanese care. May brought news of Germany's surrender in Europe. The full weight of Allied industrial capacity would now turn. exclusively toward Pacific operations. American food production, industrial output, logistics infrastructure that had sustained a two-front war would concentrate entirely on defeating Japan. The mathematics that had been impossible now became more impossible. The starvation that had killed 700,000 Japanese soldiers would accelerate because American forces no longer needed to divert resources to European operations. Tanaka received orders in June to participate in planning for homeland defense operations. The premise was that Japan would fight the American invasion of the home islands to the last man, woman, and child, if necessary. The logistics assessment was not requested because everyone knew the answer. Japan had food stocks for perhaps 4 months at current rationing levels. Combat operations would consume those stocks in weeks. Defense of the home islands would require fighting while the population starved. He attended planning meetings where generals discussed tactical dispositions, defensive positions, casualty acceptance ratios. Nobody mentioned food. Nobody discussed the fact that soldiers couldn't fight without calories. The entire planning process assumed that fighting spirit could overcome malnutrition, that duty could substitute for sustenance, that honor mattered more than survival. On August 6, 1945, American aircraft dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, 70 to 80,000 immediate deaths. The weapon demonstrated capability that made further resistance pointless, not because Japan lacked courage, but because Japan lacked any response to atomic annihilation. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki, 40 to 80,000 additional deaths. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. Japanese military and civilian deaths totaled approximately 3 million. Approximately 40%, 1.2 million deaths resulted from starvation and malnutrition-related disease rather than combat. Japan had killed more of its own people through logistical failure than the enemy had killed through combat operations. Tanaka sat in his office at Yokosuka and thought about the landing craft at Guadalcanal, 2,100 meals. That image had haunted him for 3 years. It still haunts him still, not because of what it represented about American abundance, but because of what it revealed about Japanese denial. The evidence had been visible in November 1942. The mathematics had been undeniable. Yet the war continued for nearly 3 more years, killing over 1 million Japanese who starved because the empire couldn't admit that fighting spirit didn't overcome logistics failure. The occupation began in September. American forces arrived with complete supply networks, establishing distribution systems that fed Japanese civilians more reliably than the Japanese government had fed them during the war. The occupiers brought food aid, medical supplies, and agricultural assistance. American logistics that had defeated the Japanese military now prevented Japanese civilian starvation. Tanaka was interrogated by American intelligence officers in October. They wanted to know about Japanese naval operations, tactical decisions, strategic planning. He answered their questions, but he added information they hadn't requested. He told them about the landing craft, about the garrison starvation reports, about 700,000 deaths from malnutrition, about the institutional blindness that prevented adaptation even when everyone understood the situation. The American officers listened politely and took notes. One of them, a Navy captain with logistics background, asked a question that stayed with Tanaka for the rest of his life. Why didn't your command change strategies when the logistics situation became untenable? Tanaka considered several answers. Because changing strategy meant admitting the war was unwinnable. Because institutional honor valued death over retreat. Because the system couldn't acknowledge failure without destroying the authority that sustained the system. He gave the simplest answer. Because seeing the truth and admitting the truth are different things. We saw, we couldn't admit. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.